Bonjour à toutes et
Well, hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this panel on the topic of central banks at the heart of the greening of the economy. And to cover the topic, we have a very well-balanced panel with two people from central banks. Isabelle Schnabel, who is a member of the board of the European Central Bank, Marwan El Abbassi from the Central Bank of Tunisia. We have two people from the academia, Isabelle Coupé-Soubeyran from University Paris 1, she's online. You can't see her, but she can probably see us. And Lucrezia Reichlin from the London Business School. And two people from commercial banks, Lorenzo Bini Smaghi, chairman of the Société Générale, and Olivier Nicolas, head of corporate banking and wealth management at LCL. I'm Olivier Garnier. I'm a director general in the Banque de France, and I'm a member of the Cercle des Économistes. And until a few weeks ago, I was a member of AFSE, which is an association of French economists. By way of introduction, let me cover two elements. First of all, why should central banks take into account the climate issue, and how should they take it into account? About the why, I believe that Christine Lagarde, chairman of ECB, said it very clearly yesterday in X. It's up to governments and parliaments to take care of climate, as the action in terms of climate policy often have an impact on the wealth distribution, income distribution, on the various sectors of activity that are under the control of elected authorities. So we would delure ourselves if we thought it could be done by anyone else but government. But central banks, including the European Central Bank, have a role to play for three reasons. There's a great blog that was published yesterday by Isabelle Schnabel with her colleague Frank Henderson, covering three reasons. First of all, we know that climate change and transition policies will have an impact on price stability, and this is at the very core of their mandate. The second reason, climate hazards will have an impact on the financial system, and therefore, as supervisory bodies of the financial system, they have a major role to play. And let me remind you that in the Treaty of the EU, Article 127 says that the European Central Bank, apart from its mandate on price stability, must support the general policy of the Union to contribute to its objective, which clearly means that climate policies, which are part of European policies, come under this cap. Now, let me be brief. We have here, as I said, people from central banks, commercial banks, and people from the academia. So this is enough for the why. Now, as to how, let us distinguish two elements in the role of central banks. First of all, the issue of monetary policies with the issue of how can we model and streamline into the model for inflation forecast, how can we take into account climate transition, and then there's the instruments themselves. And that's the first point. And second point, more for commercial bankers, it's the topic of supervision and financial regulations. And let me finish by saying that yesterday the European Central Bank published the first results of the first climate stress test on banks. And Christine Lagarde said a lot of progress had been made, but still there was some leeway. In France, a year ago, we carried out the first pilot climate stress test on banks and insurance. So to start with, let me give the floor to the two people from central banks, and starting with Isabelle. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I would love to speak French, but I can't.
To English, I'm sorry for this. I hope you can understand me nevertheless. So, as Olivier already mentioned, this was actually an important week for the ECB with regards to climate change because we published two things. So first of all, we published the first steps that we are going to take with regard to greening our monetary policy. And the second thing is that we published our first bottom-up climate stress test. I'm going to talk more about monetary policy here, but of course I'm happy to discuss the other issue in the discussion. So almost precisely 1 year ago, we published our climate change action plan. And this was in the context of our monetary policy strategy review. And in that action plan, we committed to contribute within our mandate to the fight against climate change. And as Olivier already mentioned, there was a clear understanding that climate change has fundamental effects on the economy and in particular on inflation. And in a recent speech, I actually distinguished three different types of inflation that may arise from climate change. So the first I called climateflation. So this is the effect of climate change itself, which is, say, if there is a drought or wildfire, you have bad harvests and food prices go up. So that's the first example. The second is fossilflation, which is related to the increase of fossil fuels in the transition to a greener economy, and one example is carbon pricing. And the third is what I called greenflation, and this is actually when there is this push towards renewable energy and there is suddenly a big demand for certain raw materials like, I don't know, copper and lithium, and that may again create inflation. And so indeed, climate change is really at the core of our primary mandate of price stability. In addition, the fight against climate change is, of course, a top priority of European lawmakers, and that means that we actually have an obligation under our secondary mandate to support the general economic policies of the EU, again, as Olivier said, without prejudice to price stability, and this actually fosters the case for us getting involved in these climate change topics. And we have now taken several quite significant steps in order to green our monetary policy, and the first and maybe one of the most relevant ones refers to our corporate bond holdings. So as you may know, previously these corporate bond purchases were kind of dictated by what we call the market neutrality principle, which basically meant that we would buy bonds according to the outstanding bonds in the market. But what we discovered is that that actually led to quite a substantial bias towards emission-intensive firms, and therefore we decided to decarbonize our portfolios over time in line with the EU climate neutrality goals and the Paris Agreement. And therefore, going forward, we are going to use a tilting approach according to an internal scoring model that relies on greenhouse gas emissions, on greenhouse gas reduction plans, and on disclosures. The second important measure refers to collateral, where we define a maximum share of assets from high-emitting companies that a bank can mobilize as collateral in our lending operations. The third is related to climate disclosures, and we said that only firms will be eligible both as collateral and also for our asset purchases if they comply with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, in short CSRD. And in addition, we also improve our own climate-related exposure. So as of the first quarter of 2023, so next year, we're going to publish the emissions of our non-monetary policy portfolios, it's like pension funds, own funds, and also of our corporate bond portfolios. And finally, we are also reassessing our risk management systems, and we are asking whether the ratings that we are using, both internal and external, properly reflect climate-related risks. So of course the ECB is facing a lot of criticism, and actually from both sides. So there are people who say we are doing too little, and there are people who are saying we are doing too much. And honestly, we would like even to be a bit quicker, but we are facing quite a few limitations on the legal side, on the operational side, but also with regard to data availability. And data actually plays a very important role in the green transition. The second point I would like to make is that those who think that climate change is not a part of our mandate should be aware that our goal to contribute to the fight against climate change in our monetary policy doesn't mean that we change our monetary policy stance. So we are not going to buy more bonds simply because of climate change, or we're not going to lend more money to banks for that reason. So it's always a priority of objectives, starting with price stability and then other issues. But and let me close with this, but we hope very much that our actions can play a catalyst role in greening the financial system, especially by strengthening incentives for climate-related disclosures, and of course by strengthening incentives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci Isabelle.
Thank you, Isabelle. She presented the viewpoint of a central bank. With Marwan, we have a central banker from a southern country who might, in fact, be more exposed to climate change. Marwan, how do you see this from the viewpoint of a central bank like that of Tunisia? Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be with you. You know, I come from a Mediterranean country. Can you hear me? I hope to be able to perform as well as our friend from the European Central Bank, because we're considered as one of the Mediterranean countries and we're supposed to be highly talkative. So I'll hope to stick to the time allotted. I have someone from the region who is supposed to be the timekeeper. I don't know where she is from. So to try and answer your question directly, if I take the example of the southern central banks, we are faced with huge difficulties. My country, for example, met with a lot of issues. For the past 11 years, it's been going through a period of political transition, which is very complicated, plus the COVID crisis. And after the COVID crisis, we were quite resilient, but then came the Ukrainian war. So all this had an impact, obviously, which has an immediate effect with an increasing in the deficits, for example, the budgetary deficit and trade balance deficit. And governments are faced with problems and then therefore turn to the central banks. And the issue of central bank remaining independent, especially in our countries, is very difficult to manage. So if you integrate the climate change in that, I'll try to be correct in my speech. I would say that for us, for countries such as ours, it's not a huge priority, especially in view of the crisis. I'm saying this, but it is the truth. The situation is such that we have a very short-term logic and one at medium and long term. And the very short term today is to be able to manage the the food for our population. We have to feed our populations. We have to supply the enough energy for the country. We have to have the right funds for that, and we have to be able to contain the impact of the various successive crises. So if I take the example of the Tunisian Central Bank, we have been part of all initiatives, whether you talk about Paris or the network of central banks for the greening of the economy. We've been part of all international initiatives. The problem is, yes, we are into it, but are we efficient? Do we have international fundings taking into account all these issues that we're facing today? Well, the reality is that we don't. There are huge difficulties, and we have the constraints of climate change as well. Today, one of our main topics is the problem of water stress and desertification, erosion. All these impacts require a lot of investments. We need to invest massively to be able to use the resource. And if you don't invest, this has a direct impact on many areas which, apart from being arid, meet with a more and more complex situation. So what is the solution? We've talked a lot about the special drawing rights. There was an initiative by Mr. Macron in Paris at a time to say that at one point there should be an appropriate funding via a fund, a special fund to manage the quote-unquote ecological crisis, and the last initiative is that of the IMF in April. I believe, unfortunately, that the funds are not there. We're talking about $40 billion now, but the needs are more of the essence of 100 or $180 billion if you have to manage the debt of African countries. So next to that, the climate issues and plus the climate shock, the problem of the various crises are such that if you don't coordinate properly all the policies and at the monetary level, at political level, you will have problems, and you have to do something to solve problems at more than the national level, because Algeria has tried that, but we now have to look at things under a different angle. We have to understand that problems are global issues, and we have to have a global solution. Thank you, Marwan, for sticking to the time. The credibility of central banks was at stake. Now we have online Jésabel Coupé-Soubeyran. Jésabel, I feel like asking you. Earlier on, Isabel was saying that some people feel that the ECB does too much, others that the ECB does not do enough. What would you answer to that, especially in view of the latest announcements of ECB? Well, thank you, Olivier. I have a lot of echo. I hope you can hear me properly. Yes, can you hear me? Yes? Yes, we hear you very well, loud and clear. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to join this prestigious panel, which is highly balanced, as you were saying, and I'm sorry I'm far away. From what we hear, it's very encouraging, because one notes that what has been greened is not only the way central banks talk, but also the way they act. And the announcements of last 4th of July by the ECB and which Isabel Schnabel has explained, is quite encouraging. These portfolio of bonds of the is being greened, the guaranteeing devices are being greened, and we're starting with a new monetary policy for that. And this goes even beyond what had been announced in the roadmap of the strategic revision a year ago. So the elements that were part of the strategic revision are the review, are there. But we go even beyond that with the announcement of the ECB. And therefore, the ECB is taking the lead of central banks that are greening their action, together with the British or the English central bank. But some are lagging behind, like the Fed in the US and most central banks in emerging countries, even though when you listen to Marwan El Abbasi, you realize that they are aware of the issue. But if you look at what central banks in emerging countries do, apart from a few exceptions, you do see that the greening of the monetary policy is not of the essence. We can say that the European Central Bank has taken a big step, with a few exceptions, obviously, but it's still a small step for climate. I don't want to underestimate the step that has been taken, as I said, but we shouldn't underestimate what is to be done, because what has been announced by the European Central Bank is only about corporate bonds and corporate assets. And this comes at a time when the programs for asset purchase are going to be stopped. There will no longer be any purchase apart from the investment of payback amounts. So it will be rather marginal. And moreover, the schedule is extremely wide, up to 2026 for some devices, which is not in line with the pace of climate change. I feel, without underestimating the legal and operational obstacles mentioned by Isabel Schnabel, I feel that the present mandate of ECB enables them to go further.
We do see that the ECB today is fully aware of climate deregulation that's attacking monetary stability, the economic stability, and that they must act, but they're still far from using all of the room to maneuver that they have in their mandate to green monetary policy. Their financing operations. So there are things that should be greened, that many think tanks say this. It would have the advantage of having the conditions for refinancing depend on the decarbonization of the bank balances, taking into account the initial situation and avoiding penalizing the adaptation efforts made by establishments whose initial balance would not be green enough, whose initial assessment would not be green enough. And so this is an interesting proposal at a constant mandate, and this is what interests the ECB. At a constant mandate, this would be the greatest contribution that it could make to solving climate deregulation. And I'm going to conclude with these aspects. We have to be aware that the current mandate, the current remit of the Euro system holds back the capacity of the central bank to finance the environmental transition. There's Article 123 that prevents direct financial assistance to countries and thus prevents the ECB and national central banks from financing investment programs, public investment programs in ecological transition without putting the central bank's monetary power at the service of environmental transition. It's highly unlikely that we'll reach the right investments 3 or 4 GDP points per year to reduce our CO2 emissions by half by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So if we look at these financing aspects, there are distinctions that can be made. The financing of profitable investments in the ecological transition can go through financial markets, private actors, financial actors and banks. This is not really a problem, but the financing of less profitable investments requires more patient investors, public banks in particular. This requires more public money, and at this level there can be direct loans from the central bank to countries that can be useful. And there's also another investment mass that's required. To finance this, we'd have to go even further. We'd have to authorize the central bank to not only loan to countries, but to actually give them money from the central bank. So this goes beyond the helicopter financing. It's a cargo plane for monetary policy within the framework of governance that would be appropriate. The central bank can't decide to use this option because it goes beyond its remit, but public policy makers and private policy makers amongst you can make this decision, and the citizens that we all are can also do it. So I think we need to realize the importance of this monetary power and how it could transform our societies to focus on the common good. Thank you, Jezebel. During the discussion, Isabelle will have the time to come back to what we should do with an open TELTE and what the central banks can do to finance states. So let's move on to our commercial bankers now. We looked at the central bank for monetary policy, but we could look at financial supervision and regulatory supervision. We'll start with Lorenzo, who was, no one's perfect. He was also a central banker in Italy and at the ECB. Thank you. As a French banker, sitting beside my supervisor,
I will speak English to make sure I don't say things that could be misinterpreted. So we understand now that greening the economy is not the primary mandate of the monetary policy, and I think it's right. But since central banks have to support the economic policies of the government, it's obvious that this is a clear mandate subject to price stability. Now, I think there are two ways to implement this mandate. One, I would call it to be consistent with. That is, make sure that your monetary policy or your supervisory policy is consistent with the mandate of the authorities. And I think Isabel mentioned, in particular, look at your macro policy framework, at all the aspects in order to forecast inflation maybe in a better way than we did in the past. Take into account all the structural changes that will happen and that are going to happen, and try to make sure that monetary policy is consistent with a better framework. Now, I think the ECB is doing this. That's very good. The only comment I would make is we have to be humble, because structural changes are just very difficult to understand, to forecast. We come out of a decade of structural changes in the opposite direction, which led us to underestimate inflation in the opposite. So my suggestion is, we have to discuss and be open, but be cautious. On the supervisory side, because I look at central bank activity on the monetary policy and supervision. Of course, the task of supervisors is to make sure that the supervisory policy is consistent with making sure that the primary objective, financial stability, takes into account the risks that come from the climate change. And so looking at banks' risk management, doing the stress tests, and we just came out of a stress test, and I want to make a comment on that. I think if we look around the economy and we look at which sectors are doing most in order to align themselves with the objectives of the COP, the various COPs, and try to anticipate and to adapt, I think the financial sector comes first or very close to being first. So I think we as banks have to be proud that we are really up to date, and there are so many agreements between banks, commitments, and if you go to shareholder meetings, you see how this issue is relevant. And second, I would say, if you look at the financial sector all over the world, I would say that European financial sector, and if I can say proudly, the French financial sector, is at the avant-garde of this. So this is just to say that, sometimes it's a bit frustrating to read the comments, even by, our supervisors, that we should do more. Yes, of course we should do more, but we have done a lot, and it would be important to recognize that we have done a lot, and we have to do more together. And in particular, what is key, I think, is the fact that our job depends on our relationship with the clients, with our clients, with companies. And we cannot have different requirements from those that our companies have. So there is an issue of consistency here between what our companies are required to do in terms of data, for instance, data provision, certification, and what we can do. It's very difficult for us to do our job if our clients, the companies, are subject to different data requirements, and this is a European issue. So this is consistency. I would move second to the second thing that central banks can do is to be proactive, to try to change things even beyond the trend. And Isabel mentioned the collateral policy. I think that is very interesting. Again, here the question is, how far can you go without creating distortions in the market? And I'm sure that's a question you ask yourself, because you don't want to have unintended consequences. And so when you move even more to greening your collateral, as it was suggested by our colleague here, you have to take into account what does it mean. Given that we are at the beginning of a phase, it could create bubbles, for instance, if the central bank does much more than the rest of the economy. Second example is supervision. Using supervision as a tool to accelerate. And here, again, we have to be very prudent not to produce unintended consequences. For instance, the threat of increasing capital requirements because of these risks. I mean, will it really help? Now, the ECB has not threatened, but when sometimes I read some speeches, I tend to see between the lines some threats. Well, maybe the ultimate risk is that you create additional capital buffers that, if the degree of substitution is not sufficiently, as economists would say, sufficiently large, then it will lead to an overall reduction of lending, even to the green sector, rather than an increase in lending. So we have to be very careful.
Lorenzo?
Yes? Yeah. Stop. 30 seconds. Final message, in my view, for the supervisor and the policy authorities, there is one fundamental issue in Europe. If we don't have an integrated capital market, we will not be able to provide all the financing that is needed to foster the greening of the economy. So the central bank, I know, are doing a lot of things, but all the authorities have to move to create a single financial and capital market in Europe. And we know that this is not done because there are people who do not want it, to be very blunt. So we have to leverage on those who want it, like the central bank, to make sure that in the next few years we're able to build this. Thank you.
Merci Lorenzo. Je note d'ailleurs que
Thank you, Lorenzo. Yesterday, when she spoke yesterday, Christine Lagarde called for the union of capital markets at the level of the central banks, we all agree on this point. So to continue on the bank side with Olivier Nicolas and with the prudential aspects and regulations, for a commercial bank and with everything that's said, I'm going to stay sober because energy transition is a type of sobriety. I only have 6 minutes. I'm going to try to respect them. We have in front of us a mountain that we need to climb. We have a hard time determining it. How many peaks will there be? There's 100 billion of additional investment. All these figures, if they're not very precise, give the size of the effort that must be made, particularly in terms of financing and investment. There's equity and debt that are together in this. So if we make these efforts, if we make these investments, can we reduce others? My feeling is that no. I know companies well, the companies in France. We cannot say today that they are all at a critical size, that they have the international size that they should have in order to be resilient. They've not necessarily made all the investments in innovation and digitalization that they should make. So we're not going to stop these investments. Companies will not stop making these investments to only make green investments. And I'm not sure if we did that, the result would be what we expected. So even if there's an intersection between the investments that we can make, there could be a very digital dimension and a positive impact on energy transition, etc. All of this must be additive, must be cumulative, and we need to finance it. And to finance all of this, there's only the banks. We're in a country on a continent where there is quite a significant financial intermediation by the banks for individuals, for companies, from small to very large sizes. Jezabel said that companies do not all go to the financial markets to get funds, and so the banks have to help. When you're a bank, you need liquidity and you need equity. It's physical, it's quantitative, and if you don't have these two ingredients, we cannot do it. The central bank is not a magician, but it has the power to make some adjustments on these two dimensions, which are the requirement for equity. For equity, if we have more requirements, if we need to take more risks, if when all other things being equal, when we ask for just more equity, we won't succeed. That's a quantitative problem, a physical problem. That's a discussion that we have to have with the regulators. They're taking place right now. We know that there are other deadlines coming up. Basel IV. This requires more equity. It's not good news. So if we need more equity for Basel IV, we won't have equity for greening, for decarbonation, etc. There's also a risk, the risk of the energy transition, and I don't necessarily know how to qualify it, how to determine it. From a macro standpoint, on a credit portfolio, there are some companies in certain sectors who are very ahead and won't have problems, and others who will have problems. We have to go into microeconomic analyses on a case-by-case basis, company by company. Have they made the turn? Will they take the turn? Will they be impacted or not? There's no single truth, no single rule. And here we really have to go and work on a case-by-case basis. So for the addition of equity for energy transition seems quite dangerous because it would be counterproductive with respect to the global needs of for financing that I've already mentioned. So we need to look at this, look at all these elements. Today we don't have a real framework, a setup for information for forecasts. So prudentially, the risks are short-term ones, and the models we use are one-year default models, and the risk of energy transition is not a one-year problem. It's 5 years, 10, 15 years. So we're not all properly equipped with tools to do this. We don't necessarily have the correct data. But when we're speaking right now, we know that we don't have these tools. As Jezebel said earlier, the central bank was very good in the last crises to provide banks with liquidity that we needed. If we go back to the subprime crisis, European debt, and COVID, each time the central bank imagined very good solutions. We talked about open TLT. This could be a good solution because we'll need this in the future. We can't just look at these as 3 to 4 year monetary policies. The subject interests us. It's very open with long investments, so we need long-term liquidity. When we had the subprime crisis, the first market that opened up was common bonds because the central banks bought them. So when the central bank buys the ones that are in line with energy transition, this could help us to deleverage, to lighten up the banking balance sheet. That's important. And to conclude, what I'd like to say, what seems important is I talked a lot about capacity problems for banks to accompany transition. One thing that is certain is that there isn't a problem of will. We all want to do this. We all want to work with our customers in energy transition, and so they have to commit to decarbonizing their portfolio transparently to measure that the euros that we lend to our customers are used for the right cause, to emit less and less carbon. These are strong commitments that will push our clients, that will push the economy to change, to transform. And we need to put all of these things side by side. What's missing today is a real global vision. We need to solve the equation, an equation with a lot of unknowns, but we still have to ask these questions. Thank you, Olivier. Lucretia is going to speak last, and so she can bring up some of the monetary policy elements and also possibly prudential elements. So Lucretia was also a center banker. She managed research at the European Central Bank in the early 2000s.
It's always nice to be the last. Yeah, can you hear me? So, well, first of all, I think that everybody is in agreement here that climate transition is the most important task of our time, is an existential problem, and however, policies have not really followed on our commitment. Even the Paris Agreement is an objective that seems to be very far from being reached. So in this context, and this will be my premise, all have responsibilities, and central banks have responsibility, but so has the private sector, banks, and the capital market. Of course, public policy as the primary actor, but also civil societies. Now, this is the point that Lagarde has made. The central banks have to be in this topic, although they don't have, they're not the first mover. And I very much agree with that, and I think this is also what Isabel said. Why are central banks important? And this is also something that Isabel said. They're important as investors. They are a big investor with big balance sheet. They're important as regulator. But also, climate risks affect the way in which monetary policy is conducted because it affects price stability and has implications both for the operational framework and the strategy. And this is maybe something that we are really at the beginning of understanding these things. This is really the new game in town for central banks to understand what this implies for inflation targeting, for example. So I will have 3 points. The first one is something that Isabella has already touched upon, is that the main criticism to what the ECB has announced, the tilting of its own portfolio, is that this is not neutral. Now, the principle of non-neutrality is a principle which is highly controversial because, this principle is defined as buying bonds in proportion to the outstanding quantities of bonds, okay? So in a way that does not alter the price of assets.
Now, this principle, and this is empirical evidence, has shown that this has meant that actually the portfolio of the ECB is brown. Why is it the case? Because the big emitters are also the big issuers of bonds. They have, tangible assets, so good collateral, so it's easy for them to issue bonds, and this is why the portfolio of the ECB is tilted to brown. And so the principle of neutrality, in a context in which asset purchases really act by altering the cost of capital, is not obviously that has to be the principle that had been stated before. And in fact, there is academic research that has actually suggested other principles related to, to the fact that the way in which asset purchases act is really by altering the cost of capital and they altering the risk profile of the portfolio. And so, we know that, and this is also a point from research, that the big emitters are also riskier. They trade at a risk premium. So that, why? Because emissions and climate risk are financially material. So this is a problem for central banks, but it's also a problem for the private sector. It's so much for the problem of the private sectors that we now have regulations and standards and stress tests and all kinds of tools to make sure that the private sector face this risk. So I think it's really an obvious next step to ask the central bank to do the same with its own portfolio. Now, there are many issues, however, and there is not much time to think about it, but I mean, I would like Isabel maybe in the second round to talk about it. Now we are shrinking the balance sheet, so presumably tilting will imply to get rid of some bonds in some key sectors. This, of course, carries the risk of stranded assets, which is a well-known risk also for the private sector. So the way in which you conduct this kind of green policy is really important. It's very important to be mindful of the transition risk, to be mindful of the fact that it's not just emissions that matters, but also the way in which companies adjust the strategy and their business model with respect to this risk, okay? We don't want all the energy companies to be closed tomorrow because that's going to be a problem, okay? So this is really the transition risk, which is very important. Again, for that, we need to have data and standards in order to, to do what it needs to be done, okay? So I come to my second point. So we need to have standards and we need to have data. This is true for the private sector, but it's also true for the ECB. How can you do these policies if you don't have reliable standards and data? So this is a topic which doesn't excite a lot of people, but it excites me a lot because I've been involved in the standard setting work, and we are in a world in which we don't have globally comparable standards. There are lots of private organizations which issue voluntary standards. They're not mandatory, they're not audited, they're not assured. And, this leads to greenwashing. So the aspiration of having globally comparable standards, it's very important, especially in a world that is becoming more and more balkanized. Since climate is a public good and is a global public good, we need to have standards for Chinese companies, for Italian companies, French companies, Tunisian companies, and so on. And so it's very good that Europe is ahead of, of the game, but we need these globally comparable standards, and actually these are not there. And there is the ECB may have a role in actually helping this convergence. The third point, I don't have time to talk about it, but is really about how to adjust the strategies when climate risk would imply two things. One is, high frequency of relative price shock and supply shocks, so nasty trade-offs for which the usual demand policy is not, the right tool, okay? So there is a set of issues there. And the other set of issues is that transition will cost money. It will mainly be fiscal money. Even if we don't believe that central banks should finance government, there is a question of how they will be supportive of public debt that is likely to go up rather than down.
Merci, Lucrezia. Donc maintenant, nous avons un peu...
Thank you, Lucretia. We have a few minutes to discuss. There's some questions online. So I'd like to come back to Isabel There were some questions. Jezebel talked about an open TLT, and Nicolas, the commercial bankers, came back to this idea, and there was another question that went even further for Jezebel, but also Lucretia. Jezebel went farther, saying perhaps the central banks need to monetize debt in order to finance green investments. So that's not what Lucretia said. But there was this question about how to finance green investments and what can central banks do. Isabel?
So we had many interesting questions. So maybe I start actually with Jezabel, who argued that the ECB could do much more in financing climate investment. And of course, one has to be aware of the fact that we are acting within a certain legal framework, and that there are limits to what we can do. So it's not that we can simply finance whatever investment seems to be desirable from a societal perspective. What we do, of course, is that we have an impact on financing conditions through our policies. And one of the most striking facts, I think, if we look at the past years, so before the pandemic, is the question. I mean, given the huge investment needs that were already there at the time and the extremely low interest rates. So why didn't governments not make use of these very favorable financing conditions to seriously start all those investments? But we actually see that over that time there was very small elasticity of investment relative to interest rates. I mean, there is a question how this was related to fiscal rules.
Et il faut voir dans quelle mesure c'est lié aux règles fiscales, etc. Mais c'est un sujet très intéressant. Alors, un point qui a été mentionné à plusieurs.
Stock of assets is going to be reduced. What's going to happen to the greening of the corporate bond stock? And in fact, I always argued it's not about flows, it's really about stock. So if we believe that the stock of our assets is biased, it may not be sufficient to adjust the flows, but at some point one may have to think about adjusting the stock. I should say that there's no decision so far on adjusting the stock, because that it's a bit more controversial than adjusting the flows. So far it's only the reinvestment. I should say these reinvestments are pretty big. So at the moment we have something like 30 billion per year, which is still, I mean, it's quite a bit, because our portfolios are actually very large. I should also say that maybe it's not just the purchases that we are actually conducting, but of course we are also sending important signals to financial markets that we are really being serious about this issue, and this will hopefully have effects well beyond the actual purchases that we do. On the green TLTRO, we always said that this is something that we could also consider. We have not yet taken any decisions on that. I mean, there's of course in a sense the same issue that I discussed before, namely that I mean, of course, you first need a monetary policy objective for conducting these operations. And I mean, of course, during the pandemic, we were doing a lot of refinancing operations, and there was a reason to do that. Of course, if there is no such reasons to run those operations, then it becomes much more difficult. So I fully agree, by the way, with Lorenzo, who argued that we, in a sense, I mean, you didn't use the word, but that we need a green capital markets union. I always thought that this could be a branding that could really make a difference. But somehow, I mean, we haven't yet, I think, the dynamic that we need. And there, I think Lucrezia is very right that, of course, this is also related to all these issues of standards. And, of course, these standards, it's not sufficient that they are European, but at least they have to be European. And then, ideally, they should be global. I mean, on your points on capital, I mean, of course, the capital. I mean, I'm not a supervisor myself. We have the Chinese wall within the ECB, as you know well. But of course, the capital requirements have to reflect the risks that are there. And I mean, I'm reminded of discussions that I had with my PhD supervisor, Martin Helwig, who had strong views on capital, on bank capital, but I won't repeat that. Thank you.
Alors, malheureusement, comme il nous reste très peu de minutes, mais rapidement, peut-être Lorenzo, j'ai envie de...
Very briefly, Lorenzo, I feel like turning to you. Do central banks do enough or not enough in terms of greening monetary policy? And this time I'm going to speak French, if you want. I would say that in Europe we should be proud of being of taking the lead. Whether we look at the central bank, there's no comparison. The result is 6-0, 6-0 with the Fed, for example. And we have a process, really. It's a process, but to answer Isabel and what she mentioned about the supervisor, investors all over the world are not forced to invest in European banks. They can invest in other sectors, or they can invest in banks in other countries. So we have to have a profitability of equity that is attractive. We're not utilities. I know that some people in the academia would want banks to be utilities, but we are not. We have to be attractive to investors. And I believe we do a lot to try and be attractive, because today when I talk to investors and shareholders, they ask us to be green. They ask us to have a green P&L sort and a green balance. And we've been trying to do that for a long time, but you can't add on a lot of layers of equity because, as was being said, we can't do everything. And if I'm to finish on this same topic, we do not have a capital market. So all finances that are and all financial flows produced in Europe have to be on the P&L of banks. And it has to be well done if we don't want to have a systemic risk. So we could have to develop this capital market, whether it be a green one or a blue one or whatever you want to, blue if you want to give it the color of Europe. But we won't have the energy transition in Europe if we don't have this European capital market. And if we do not have a European capital market, it's because someone doesn't want us to. Just like someone didn't want, some people didn't want the monetary union a while ago, or a banking union 20 years ago. So these people maybe wanted to keep their power on their markets. So we have to fight this at political level, and I hope that the president, the prime ministers in Italy, the chancellor in Germany will realize that we won't do this if we won't have this proper greening, if we don't have this financial integration in Europe. Thank you, Lorenzo. If I'm to conclude, I would say there's a federating topic, that of the Union of Capital Markets, and at marketing level, which would be, we would call it the Union of Green Capital Markets, or the Green Union, whatever name you want to give it. And Lorenzo was saying maybe some people are opposed to it or don't want that, but maybe it's a technical topic that is not really fascinating to political authorities, and there may not be so many obstacles after all. Maybe via the greening, it would be a way of telling the public opinion and governance, and as the public opinion is what is moving governments to us, they will have to tell the governments that this capital market is important for the planet and climate. Thank you.
Bonjour, bonsoir à toutes et à tous.
Hello, everyone. We are most happy to be with you. I'm Jérôme Chapier, director of in La Croix. I'm very happy to be here for the session number 31 on taxation, a democratic issue. Talking about democracy is really at the very core of the topic, because we could have endless discussions about the use of taxes and their impact, but if we do not have the approval of citizens and the elements about the finality, the social and ethical goals of this, it would be no end. So we have with us Béatrice Dehaye, tax director at LVMH, Bernard Sananes at ELAB, we have Edna Jaime, who is Mexican. She's been in public life for 25 years, and she's at Evalua, a group that assesses public policies. And remotely, we have Michel Sicurel, who has been active in talking about fiscality and public policies in Europe. And hello, Bertrand Badré. You are a member of the Cercle des Économistes, and you will therefore introduce the topic. Thank you very much. It is indeed a challenge to mobilize people to talk about fiscality and taxation in Aix at 5:30 when it's 34 degrees. But I can tell you that the people who prefer to go to a spa or to the swimming pool or to eat an ice cream will be missing something. More than the word taxation, the important word is a democratic issue. What can our democracies take, especially at tax level? Obviously, it's a multifaceted topic. In a way, we are all taxpayers, so we all have our opinion on taxes. We are all citizens. We all have our opinions on democracies. We're all the guarantors of loans that have cost a lot to the country, even though we hope to pass it on to our successors. So obviously, we'll only cover but a few topics about this. Let me give you a few ideas to initiate the discussion. To be somewhat prospective, because the umbrella topic of these REA are to succeed in transforming the world. So there are the elements of global taxation. Can you tax multinational companies? I believe my neighbor will say a word about this. There's the issue of national discussions. We'll see that there are fiscal topics. Should we change VAT, the taxation of oil products? And then we all have in mind the topic of yellow vests or yellow jackets. So after 6 months of political campaign, we hardly covered these topics, even though we know that taxation is the basis of representative democracy, as it is based on taxation. So the issue is to see if taxation, which is a highly democratical topic, only became a technical topic from experts. And there's the other issue in Florida. The governor of Florida sanctioned very strongly the Disney Group for disputing an educational policy of the state. So the governor said, well, okay, you will lose your advantages, your tax incentives. Let me finish with two things. I love investing in sustainable development in emerging countries. In 2015, for sustainable development, we had a roadmap for the planet with the Paris Agreement on climate. We made an enthusiastic choice of an inclusive economy, which would be both resilient and sustainable. Can we head in that direction without revisiting our tax systems? And I'm not just talking about the carbon tax. Above and beyond carbon tax, should we review and revisit our tax systems to make them resilient and sustainable as well. So this is an issue of understanding and deliberation. Second thing, the fiscality of emerging countries. There again, I'm happy that we have Laura with us today. We decided to change our planet to make it sustainable, but it's not an issue of development or money transfer from migrants. It's not only an issue of investment in the countries, it's an issue of local taxation. The reality is that this transition will be funded by taxes in these countries, but in most of these countries, taxation is low with a rate of 10 to 20% as much. Very little VAT, very little taxes. And as we had a leapfrog in the field of telecoms, can we hope for a fiscal or taxation leapfrog jumping directly to a better system? So I'll stop at that. I hope that some major changes in economics are necessary but difficult, and one of them is that of taxation, and there's a lot to be discussed today. Where in a connected manner with our democracy, which is quite fragile. Well, right away, let me give you the floor, Bernard Sananès. You know the way, a few minutes for each, and then we'll take questions from the public. What strikes you, Bernard Sananès? What are you stricken by when you look at this in France? So, over the past 10 years, three elements have really been striking. In 2013, the Minister of Economy and Finance himself talked about people being a tax overflow, really, people being fed up with taxation. And then people remember that he was asked, what do you do with the money? And also there's the famous whatever the cost during the COVID crisis, and so taxation no longer seems to be one of the top concerns, far behind the purchasing power. In fact, not enough. And even in the issue of purchasing power, we don't consider that the tax issue is so important. Obviously, there is this link with citizenship and democracy and this consent agreement to pay the taxes. First of all, are taxes still seen as a citizens' act? Well, recently, I've sort of taken a poll, and the result is divided 52-48. In what way? 52 for no and 48 for yes. So we do see that this is a system that is quite divided, and on this issue to know whether it's a citizen's action, there's the issue of do I contribute more than I get from the system? Well, people feel that they give more to the system than they get back. Second question, fair policy. Second question that was asked, no surprise, for 70% of the French people, the tax system is not fair. And there's not so much difference between the richer and the poorer. It's interesting to note, even though an obvious majority of French people feel that to fund pensions and the economy, you should tax more the wealthier, and this is understandable. And next point about fairness. This fairness is a topic the minister knows well, even if he discovers the topic, the taxing of GAFAMs. 80% of the French people feel it would be fair to tax the GAFAMs. So we observe that consent to pay taxes is clearly more favorable in regions that are so-called doing well. If you compare Brittany, Pays de Loire, and Île-de-France that are doing well, and if you compare them to Bourgogne-Franche-Comté or Hauts-de-France or Val-de-Loire, There's 10% difference in their consent to pay taxes. People will say, well, why should I pay the same taxes if my children have to travel 15 kilometers to go to school every day when my cousin's child only has 2 metro stops to go to school? It's unfair. And third topic is, are taxes well used? No, for 70% of the French people. And this is an issue of how the taxes should be used. The question is, if you were to pay more taxes, why would you use the taxes? First issue is health, then police. And there's quite a few elements in that. Let me present 3 things. First of all, taxes are badly communicated when in your daily life, when you go to the police, when you go to a hospital, they never remind you the taxes that have been paid for that. The second thing, when you pay, when you have to fill in your tax returns, maybe there should be a possibility to say, well, this is what I would like my taxes to do, to enable me to do. And then the third possibility, we talk a lot about referendum. It would be a good thing every year if people, when they filled in their tax returns, could say whether they're satisfied with the way their taxes were used. Thank you, Bernard. Beatrice Deshaies, let me give you the floor, because very often LVMH is considered as the top taxpayer in France. Do you have a viewpoint about that, and about the multinational or international stakes there? You're right. We're the first top taxpayer in France, but I'm not here to market the fiscal policy of LVMH. But to return to what Mr. Sananes was just saying, there's interesting things in this: the reaction of citizens to paying taxes, their consent, and the fair taxing of GAFAMs. For a while, I've been questioning the public. I won't do it today, but when I ask the question in a conference to ask people whether they are happy to pay taxes or they feel they pay too much taxes, most of them tell me that personally they feel they pay too much taxes. And it's quite often the case, at least. And the second question I ask them usually is, do they consider that large corporations, not small companies, but large corporations, pay enough taxes or not enough? And most of them, even when I have corporate leaders in the company, in the audience, they mostly say no, the large corporations don't pay enough taxes. So let me try to react to this and shed as much light as possible. Well, on this issue of taxes and a democratic issue, we're faced with a paradox. At democratic level, the companies that can mention a tax citizenship have no voting right. So it's a paradox, really. And secondly, how can we find a fair answer and a fair redistribution for companies that develop at international level? Because most of major groups in France and international groups have activities throughout the world. As far as the position we have in the democratic debate is, I feel that we must show that we are taxpayers, and earlier we talked about a carbon tax, which was a failure in France, and some companies took this into their hands and decided that they were going to impose on themselves a carbon tax, and this is what LVMH has done. So, second topic, which may sound more technical, but it's important because I'm a technician and I might shed some light for you. this topic of international taxation and how can we find a fair redistribution of the taxes. For about 10 years, for a decade, our countries, especially with the arrival of the GAFAs in the economy, our countries were faced with a difficult issue to know if our tax systems were still efficient to tax companies whose physical footprint in the countries where they were present may have been very small. This is when two major projects of international tax reform appeared, and they're still being discussed. The first one is how can we redistribute better the tax basis between the countries, anchoring it on the consumption country. And secondly, can we find a minimum tax because these companies don't pay enough taxes, and if we could increase it by 10 or 15%, we could find an answer to all that. It's true enough that the international system is probably finished because it's very much attached to a system with a physical base, with warehouses, stores, etc., physical people, and this is something that does not correspond to the GAFAs. OECD introduced the famous pillar number 1, which is about redistributing more fiscal base in the distribution countries, the market, for like France for the GAFAs, or to impose a minimum 15% tax, whatever the operations. This was announced at great noise more than a year ago, and to be honest, nothing has been applied. And in the meantime, the companies have to face the countries, for example, LVMH, when we sell in China and we have consumers in China, maybe the pillar number 1 is not active, but how can we sort of act as this tax is not active yet? Very often, the announcements by the governments or their representatives are a bit too fast, because you have to respond to the questioning and the demands of citizens when they say, where do you stand for GAFAs? And so it's difficult to answer, and we have to adapt in the meantime to satisfy the expectations of all. So please make headway quickly, because it's urgent now. Jean-Noël Darroux can answer you. I was hearing him say that things are progressing, and we'll also give the floor to Edna Jaime. But before I give the floor to her, we have a visio conference with Michel Sicurel. Hello. We heard that our tax systems have to be revisited. They're obsolete. Do you agree?
I think it's worse than that. I think that taxation is a necessary evil, but intrinsically a bad tool. And I would like to explain that. I'm talking about all obligatory taxation. Bertrand Berdret was saying between consentment to taxation and that has a political origin that's as opposed to monetary policy, because that guarantees political independency. They were able to brilliantly globalize, while taxation is incapable of transforming the changing of the world. All of the perversions can be linked to this. The sound is not great. Apparently you can't hear us. I'll see if our technicians can do anything. Please continue. You were saying that taxation suffered from extreme politicization? And I said especially in France, because French taxation, and I'm using strong terms, it can trick people because it looks for an announcement effect rather than a real effect. Taxes that are the most in the media, the most discussed by politicians, are often just minor, like the tax on fortune, or they're secondary, like income tax, that bring in less than 2/3 that what the CSG does and half of what VAT does. So to take the example of the patriotic prison and national habits, their rights acquired on tobacco, alcohol, and wine. On tobacco, it's 65% alcohol, 30%, and wine, only 1%. And Père Mendes France must be turning over in his grave now for 40 years when he sees. So taxation is political. It's not visionary. It's the feet are stuck in the clay. And climate experts say that the carbon tax is the best tool to decarbonate, but it'll never be applied globally, so it won't exist. The principle of an adjustment mechanism that was adopted by the EU at the last day of the French presidency is an excellent thing, and it addresses some European imports with high carbon levels, steel, cement, etc. It's $500 million, just a small proportion of global GDP. So there's confiscatory taxation on the capital, as according to Piketty, to light against the growing of people's own personal wealth. It's a brilliant product of exportation that convinces intellectuals, but no governments to adopt it. It's far from a political gesture. We know that taxing investment capital and companies is harmful to employment, and employment will always be the first driver for increasing wages. And as Madame Beatrice said earlier, with the OECD, that we have the highest taxation rates, and we will never believe in globalized taxation, but the British use the same term for fiscal policy, for both fiscal policy and budgetary policy, which is not the case in France. So it's impossible that the major transformations in the world go without an increase in public expenditure. Mr. Lorenzri wanted to reconcile Keynes, this provident state and innovation, and that's very necessary today. Without a contribution of investment and protection, we will not be able to take out the challenges of the climate, given the demographic explosion. The global population, let me remind you, will double from 5 billion to 10 billion in 50 years. So we're discovering pandemics. There's the fragmentation of the world, the war in Ukraine. We have to mobilize private savings. I think private savings with a guarantee of the state, but public power must share expenditures and the risks of these transformations. But supporting and working with the big transformations can have to face another transformation in Western society. That's the shift in the middle classes. They're threatened by emerging work, artificial intelligence, and the middle class, too rich to get any support and too poor to support the taxes that finance the assistance, feel that they're being abandoned. As Bernard Salanès said earlier, I contribute more than I receive, and the middle classes really believe this. And getting the rich to pay is politically impossible. It's been asked for forever, but we always tax the middle class. We never tax the rich. So the fiscal policy in developed worlds, regardless of their structure, always arrive at similar results. They're just slightly redistributive. So France does not escape the rule, and it's because it has the biggest record as a providence, as a welfare state. You have to conclude, please. I'll conclude by saying that I think we're going to have to use debt, virtuous debt, that fosters growth, employment, and competitiveness. And to conclude, I wanted to say in a word that we'll have to listen to the comedian Alphonse Allais. We have to ask more from taxes and less from the people who pay taxes. Thank you. Mr. Sicurel, you'll come back when we take questions. You would like to talk about the participation of citizens in the elaboration of taxation. And in Mexico, Mrs. James, do your compatriots consider taxation the same way as we do, as Marcel Adenes said about France?
We have a much problematic budget taxation and budgetary policy. Thank you very much. I feel very privileged to be here, and I'm going to talk about Mexico perspective. And I will do that because I think it reflects a very essential problem that is not only Mexican. As probably you know, Mexico is firmly established as an upper middle income nation, is part of the G20 and also the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. At the same time, Mexico has tremendous challenges and limitations in terms of taxations, which are the reflection of a weak economy governance and even a weaker rule of law. What we have today in Mexico can be summarized as bad taxation and worse representation. If taxation is the expression of a social pact, then it is clear that Mexico urgently needs a new social pact. We have bad taxation and worse representation not because we pay too much taxes, but because we pay too little. The average OECD country has a tax to GDP ratio of 33.5%. In Mexico, ratio is 17.9. However, the state in Mexico is not technically broken. After massive economic crisis in the 80s, it learned to live by its own means. Since then, fiscal discipline has been maintained, but that has provoked that the state in Mexico is rather poor. A government living with its means that are not handful has translated into a chronic underinvestment in infrastructure, public security, education, health. This in turn has contributed to lock Mexico into a low growth, low productivity trap. Public expenditure in Mexico also lacks quality and lacks accountability. This is a very important point. For instance, in 2013, a tax reform increased revenue. We have tax reforms. And to its credit, the current administration has made great efforts to ensure that big taxpayers pay their share. But despite increases in revenue, Mexico has chronically underinvested in physical and human capital. government has more money, but it's not well assigned. In Mexico Evalúa, the think tank I lead, we have made a sustained effort to understand what we call the black box of public expenditure. We have found that the governance of budgeting fails to ensure proper oversight on all its phases. The federal government, the government, has enormous discretionary power, the executive power, to change the budget as it seems to fit, while Congress is secondary actor which fails to perform its role of oversight. The government spends the amounts it doesn't spend, the amounts it got approved. It spends in a discretionary matter, it spends either more or it spends in different ways. So as I have to conclude, so as you can see, there's no way of a nexus, of a link between budgeting, taxation, and effective representation. We have promoted a proposal of a fiscal council, a very technical instance in the congressional branch, in order to make sound analysis and to provide to lawmakers with information that can put the same level of ground to the executive and congressional branch. If I have more time, I will return to this point. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup et on pourra effectivement revenir sur ce point. Jean-Noël Barrot, beaucoup de...
Thank you very much. Jean-Noël Barrot, many questions. We would like to tell you about the digital issues, but maybe I saw you reacting earlier on to what Béatrice Dehaye was saying about intentions of OECD. You were saying things are progressing. On a better way of taxing companies at a time when the national location is a complication. Yes, thank you very much. I believe that, as Bertrand Badré was saying, the topic of the panel is really the right one. Is taxation a democratic challenge? Yes, it is. And suffice it to look at French history with the long series of sort of tax revolutions to see that. At the time of Richelieu, when Richelieu tried to centralize in Paris a collection of taxes, the people from Aix just started wearing bells to create a demonstration and protest. In the end, this turned back on them, but the taxes and the demonstration was stopped, but the taxes were not re-centralized. So taxes, we all agree, are a must. But we must have a taxation system which has a number of specificities, and I'd like to mention three, which are not always convergent. It must be measured or controlled, efficient and fair. Well, average or controlled, it's a relative word. But for a long time in France, we were under the feeling that tax pressures were higher than what it was in other OECD countries, which led the previous government to have a very ambitious speech and very stable one on the issue of taxation, because contrary to the two previous mandates where taxes were increased, then reduced, then increased and reduced again during the first 5-year tenure of Emmanuel Macron, the taxes were clearly reduced despite the crisis, and we managed to get out of the first position on the podium of countries where we have the highest tax pressure in OECD. So this perception, which is the one we have not only in France but in other countries about the level of taxes in France, and I believe that the this feeling of being fed up at tax levels is something that people used to have and maybe don't so much have now. So taxation that has to be controlled and that must be considered as fair. People say, when economists say, when you tax an object or something, if it's an elastic base, you run the risk of this basis being reduced, and then in the end you will no longer have anything to tax. The big mistake of our leaders for decades was not to listen to economists, and in particular in France, to consider that the industry or companies were something that would never leave France, and that you could organize your taxing around them, and that was rather heavy and probably led to the loss of 2 million industrial jobs over the 3 or 4 last decades. And nowadays, as we have seen that the tax differences were too important with other countries, this has led to a reduction in production taxes with the economic recovery plan in order to give some breathing time for French companies. Now they are coming back to France. Last year, in 2021, there were twice as many plants opening in France than plants closing. So we have a lot to catch up, but we're on the right track. So an efficient taxation is a taxation that takes into account the fact that when you have a fiscal base, if you tax it too much, it erodes, and in the end, you have nothing to tax anymore. And then the last thing is that it must be fair and seen as fair. And if you talk about corporate taxes, Beatrice was right in saying that people that consider that not only GAFAMs but big international corporations are not sufficiently taxed. And this is the result of the major evolutions in our world with the globalization of exchanges, the fragmentation of production lines. You have a value chain which is made up in all corners of the planet. Where do you tax them? And then you have the digital elements where products are sometimes produced very far from where they are consumed. So this led to a feeling of unfairness from citizens, small and medium-sized companies who pay the full Monty, so to say. And they are upset to see that next to them they have big companies that manage to divide their production or separate the production place of the digital services, and they manage to escape taxes, which is why OECD started this huge work, which was mentioned earlier, with an agreement of 136 countries around corporate taxes. This is Pillar 2, and the place where they're taxed, Pillar 1. And this is why the French presidency of the EU put this topic at the very top of its agenda. So we didn't reach an agreement fully. You may have followed the topic. Poland and then Hungary tried to push their advantage. They were not opposed in principle to the minimum taxes on these companies, but they did realize that they were the last countries to have to give their agreement. And so they tried to obtain a few things from their European partners to get to the global agreement. But I'm rather optimistic, and Bruno Le Maire will probably confirm that tomorrow. We'll end up with this major historical headway in tax level, meaning we will compensate for this major unfairness which was leading to people failing to consent to pay taxes. Okay, to answer the question, taxation, a democratic issue. In France, we have a government that drafts the financial law, and the parliament votes for it. As you know, You know that the parliament is going to have more power now because the majorities are more reduced. So we'll have a most interesting democratic debate this fall, and they'll have to decide on the taxes that are levied. So let's meet in the fall.
Thank you, Jean-Noël Barrot. A few questions and some comments from all of you, if you'd like to take the floor on the points that were raised during the discussion, then we'll take a few questions from the room. I think there's a node that we didn't really talk about, taxation as a democratic issue. Does this question make sense when in the context of globalization? But there's fiscal tax competition between the great blocs, but also from the French side within the European Union. So Jean-Noël Barrot, perhaps you'd like to answer, and Michel Sikuren might have an opinion also. When we're talking about taxation as a democratic issue, are we forgetting that countries are competing against each other to attract money? Yes, you're right. In truth, in a certain number of countries, the government were like the rabbits caught in the headlight. We had big global companies that make decisions to locate their offices based on the tax environment in the country. And so the only possible reaction is to drop the company taxes to bring in as many companies as possible. What is new, and that's the reason for which this agreement that was found at the OECD that will soon be passed into law is major, because the countries of the OECD, European countries, have decided to work together to end this taxation competition that was hurting them in the end. It brought their tax revenue down and reduced their ability to finance their fiscal model and their public services, and this is important. The countries, by joining cartels, if you like, in quotation marks, allow them to find a solution. The Western countries, European countries, in this race to stop the lowest taxation rates, which was harming everybody. I don't want to provoke you, but I'd also like to talk about the reality of this question. Recently, I was talking with someone at Bercy, who's in charge of artificial intelligence for tax audits. So they set up systems to predict and identify tax anomalies so that they can identify what will happen. This is at the French Ministry of Finance. Is there a similar program at a European level? Because it would be even better to do it together. And he said, no. Our challenge is to protect France. And the reality and the paradox that we're confronted with is that taxation is a question of sovereignty, absolute sovereignty. It's the only way that you can have secure resources. And today, like we are always, we're having to deal with the fact that it's difficult to agree when you have to share the money and you don't agree on how to share the money. And that's the real question. So as companies, we're in the middle of this, and the citizens also. We see these wars setting up, but the taxation war between countries is a real thing in OECD countries that were reinforced by the G7, et cetera. But the reality is that the Americans don't really want this reform because their industry will be impacted. The French don't want their companies, our company, to pay more tax in the U.S. and in China. When I talk to people from Bercy, they say, we get money in from the GAFA, but LVMH, you're going to continue to pay your tax in France. I said, we don't care, 25% in France, 25% in China. It's the same thing. I'd rather pay in France. We're a French company, and I know where the money's going. But I just wanted to talk about the reality, really, of the situation. Bernard Sananès, to comment on Jérôme's question, in the relationship with globalization, and we've seen how the French opinion has changed about globalization. It's perceived as a negative thing, a threat, not only in the middle classes, but also in the wealthier classes, there's a feeling that taxation is unequal and globalization is disloyal competition. And this is a big challenge for Europe and the perception of Europe, because what we accept or tolerate for the rest of the world, we hope that at a European level, this harmonization will lead to more faithful competition. Would you like to comment?
As was said in the table, taxation, tax structure, tax policies are sustaining status quo. And I think there is a consensus that the status quo is unsustainable. So we need to change, and we need to open our minds to think out of the box, to try to manage this reality, because status quo is unsustainable. Democracies are failing because there is few expectations about democracy, few expectations about public goods. Inequalities are growing, gaps are growing. So I think we need to think out of the box, and of course have always in mind that taxation is related to representation and to democracy, so it is not an easy quiz to solve.
Je vois quelques mains qui se lèvent, peut-être au deuxième.
I see some hands going up. Very quickly, we just have a few minutes. Samuel? We talked about the fact that taxes went down in the last 5 years, it's true, but we know that with whatever it costs, the French policy, that taxes will go back up. But the reform of international taxation, as proposed by the OECD, is not going to bring that much in terms of the tax base in France. If tomorrow we have to raise more taxes, new taxes, what will they be? And could they be European taxes? Jean-Noël Barrot, you can't count on the current government to raise taxes. Taxes went down, and I'll repeat what I said earlier. In Nicolas Sarkozy's 5 years, they went down before they went up under François Hollande, and then they went down. This absence of predictability, this tax improvisation, is one of the reasons that companies mention when they describe or explain why France is running behind economically. In the last 5 years, the president made commitments, very firm commitments, to bring down company taxes and to get rid of our local inhabitants tax, some labor taxes. And all of these promises were held despite the crises we went through, while bringing our public deficit under the 3% of GDP under 2018, in 2018 and 2019. That hadn't happened for 10 years before. So it's possible to bring taxes down while we bring down the public deficit. They're not contradictory, and this is our objective when we're searching for growth, looking to increase labor in our country. So I'm from the Energy Association. When we talk about the carbon tax, we talk about emission taxes. Have we thought about an upstream tax that will penalize petroleum oil companies? The carbon tax today is on emissions, carbon emissions. Could we think about the fact that it would be more operational to be taxing the producers of fossil fuels, the oil companies and coal companies? Maybe this will lead to some reactions or not. Jean-Noël Barrot, you say that it would be more effective. We'd have to talk about this. The tax will be passed on along the value chain in the different markets. So it's something that could be studied. So the consumer has to feel the carbon tax, otherwise it will be it won't hurt anyone. Sometimes we tax the consumer, but it's passed back onto the producers. So there are incidences in taxation that aren't taken into account in the public debate that we need to look at. We've got 2 minutes. thank you, Mr. Barrot, for having talked about the revolution in Aix-en-Provence. When we consider the rates of abstention in the last elections in France for the municipal elections and the presidential election, could we see another revolution of this type in France? So Bernard Sanès, I don't feel that right now things have happened recently that have relaxed the relationship to taxation. I don't think it's going to be one of the drivers. It could be part of the aggregation of reasons for which people are angry. A new tax on ecology provoked problems with with the yellow jackets, and I think that people are more angry about reduced purchasing power. So the gentleman in the front row, quickly. We're at the Rencontre Économique, and I hear questions about raising or bringing taxes down. So we're getting rid of a fiscal policy. It's increasing some taxes but bringing others down. And here I wonder, I question you, has the President of the Republic given up on democracy because his roadmap is to absolutely give up on increasing taxes? Because it's a driver for democracy, as we said. We did it. We considered that social protection shouldn't only be paid by the labor force, so we brought those contributions down, and it was offset by an increase in the tax, the CSG, with a larger base that impacts capital also. So we did it in the past, and we'll look at this in the future. Unfortunately, we have to conclude. We can't take your question, but come after the panel. We have to conclude, and so I leave the floor to Bertrand for this. Thank you all. It's up to me to conclude a debate that was very rich, confirming the interest of the question that we raised, taxation, a democratic issue. Bernard underscored that there was a link between taxation and democracy that's a heavy but yet fragile link that's poorly understood, with impact on society and on the regions. We need to raise awareness about this. How can we strengthen the link? And at a national level, like at the international level, there are points of misunderstanding. I like the idea of an annual referendum to see if we agree or not. We tend to talk about taxation on individuals. Beyond that, there's taxation of companies. As Beatrice said, they're taxpayers without the right to vote. So for companies, there's an international question. In this world of transformation, there's competition, there's a debate that's more or less civil, more or less violent. And taxation is, above all, in a territorial base that is deeply challenged by competition. It plays a role in transformation. It's difficult. We're trapped by some approaches like the French wealth tax. And we're running behind social expectations, and it's difficult to manage given expectations. It's also crucial. The fragility of middle classes is very important in our taxation acceptance. The question of the participation of citizens, thank you, Edna, for bringing this up. It's crucial on this topic like on others. We saw that with our citizens' debate, taxation can't stay a technical topic. People have to be involved and take ownership of this question. It's true in Mexico. It's true for us. Accountability is very important. I was happy to hear Jean-Noël Barrot remind us that we can advance, and we hope that the OECD will come into play. People were skeptical to my left. The question of taxation, correct taxation, as Alphonse Allais said. So we have two tests ahead of us. The first one, as Jean-Noël said, the test of the National Assembly, our parliament. How are they going to debate these questions in a mature, transparent way? And there's another test. We talked about European sovereignty. I don't think we can talk about European sovereignty without taxation, because everyone's going to play in their own home field. This question of taxation is not a technical question, but it does have technical aspects. And the technical aspects can't transform the perception that's at the heart of the topics here. How can we transform globalization? It's our national social pact, our European social pact, our global social pact that's being challenged. We had 382 years after the revolt in Aix-en-Provence. Maybe here in Aix-en-Provence, the Cercle des économistes will launch this positive tax revolt. Thank you, Bertrand. Thank you, everyone.
system in Europe and in France more specifically is very under stress, which means that, you know, high energy prices, this is a problem for the purchasing power, for competitiveness of companies, and all means as well that topics of safety of supply today, we are in a system in which it was reminded us by the three leaders of Total Energy, EDF and ENGIE. We are in a system where there is little margin for maneuver on the energy system. So in the short term, lots of tension, and we evidence two topics which are essential for the energy system, supply safety and the notion of cost. That's the short-term topic. Medium term, we should add to these two notions the safety of supply and cost. There is also the decarbonation issue, because another collective challenge is that the energy system contributes to decarbonation, to the damaging of carbon neutrality in our economies. There are two subjects, short-term and medium-term topics which are ahead of us. Now, to talk about that today, we have three keynote speakers whom I will introduce briefly, then I will give them the floor. Michał Kurtyk, who is former Minister of Climate and the Environment from Poland, former President of COP24. Mariam Lenio, who is President of the EVEDIS board. As you know, EVEDIS is the distribution network of electricity distribution network, because somewhat is not understood, and it is. And Patrick Pouyanné, President, CEO of Total Energy. Michał, you have the floor. Thank you, Claire. Thank you for using an English term, which defines the feel in the panel. You're not actually lost in terms of language, but I will continue in French, hoping that it will work. So, you said it. We are heading towards a very difficult winter. At best, there will be high, amazing, exorbitant energy prices. Most likely, there will be shortages of energy and energy cutoff. So it's easier to say it if we are not from the country, and if we're not from the politicians, and if we're not an active politician. So at the worst, there will be a conjuncture of energy, economic, and in the worst case scenario, health and military crisis as well. So clearly, we are heading towards the perfect storm. So this is a major crisis that is looming away, and we have to understand the scope of such a crisis. And the scope of the crisis is to tell the truth, to tell the truth vis-à-vis what is to be expected. So there is not one good solution for this crisis. The solutions that will emerge will be sometimes a bit contradictory. Short term is that will be contradictory is what we have to do in long term. But anyway, we have to have this discourse, otherwise we will miss a great opportunity to evolve. Because historically speaking, we can see that what makes our societies evolve and the energy mix is the constraints, the crisis. This is what was the case in 1973. Ever since in the Netherlands, we don't heat the house up to 19, but now 18 and 17, and it's stayed like that. You change habits only if there is a constraint. But back to energy, back to the current situation. We are in total configuration of the European energy mix. We are halfway between a former paradigm based on networks run centralized in many European countries, with the exception of France, based mainly on fossil energy, including my country, which is a great example, with 70% of coal-fired power plant. But we're going towards a new system, which is still blurry, a dream, which is close to a new form of utopia, which is proposed by our colleagues from Brussels, which would be a fully renewable model. Well, there is one problem, is that the renewable are not constant. Wind power, sun power do not function all over the year, you know. So either you accept that there will be constant shortages, and in countries like mine where winter are fairly harsh, well, we still cannot heat up the world with wind and gas, you know. We need transmission of energy. We need storage means of energy. So we are in a situation where if would allow an example of excellent challenge, we are in full work. The line A, B, C, D of area are in full work, and there is this cool start, and we said TGV won't work. So there you go. So in such a configuration, what's the answer? Well, the short-term response would be for energy. It's not just winter, it could be 2 to 3 years. So short-term, unfortunately, and I'm saying it with, you know, I'm sorry, you know, because I'm president of the COP24, short-term, in France you say, you know, get ready and, you know, import gas and oil from all over the place. You got a coal-fired power plant in Garda. It was shut down end of March and reopened on April 15th. So this kind of reaction, unfortunately, is short-term. This is the tactic, and this will be complicated. But otherwise, if we don't save the old system, it's going to be very complicated because there will be a hole. So what's going to happen in the medium and long term, 10, 15 years? I think that this is a system that will be totally different. First, because we need to gain access to new energy resources, biogas, you know, nuclear, geothermy. But we can do that only at the local scale. And what's most interesting is that the local dimension makes it possible to have energy storage solutions, not just electricity, but heat or cold, and therefore with a central role played by the networks as well. Marian. So we will need to respond to rethink the top-down dirigist current model towards more decentralized, smaller system with better energy efficiency, rebalancing of the energy assets, which sometimes are specific to territories, and we can associate building, you know, in the building industry in this equation. That's one solution. The second solution would be, which have been recommended for years, would be the rebirth of the nuclear line in Europe. Now, let's be mad, let's be crazy, let's dream. You know, we reopened the European nuclear domain. You're from Poland, you maybe forgot that there is Germany next to you. No, I know Germany is there. Germany is fiercely against it, but the crisis is an opportunity to shift the lines. Shift again that we, you know, the crisis now is going to be a hell of a tsunami, and we'll have to change the outline. We shift the lines, and this is the perfect time to say so. And my last point, I was in the Polish government for years. I was a minister, and I know what it means to be a minister facing such a situation. You know, huge difficulty, but there is a solution which is easy solution for the minister to say, dear citizens, no problem, we're dealing with it. Don't worry, we're here for you. We solve everything, and if some people are, face problem, we'll compensate for them. There is good intention. We'll have a huge increase of energy poverty. But if you think the crisis under public debt distributed through all forms of, not just France, you know, in Poland, we do exactly the same principle, the same instruments. If you hide the crisis under those instruments, it falls through. And if you allow me to paraphrase Churchill in Munich, we can say, okay, the government have a choice or for exorbitant price or colossal debt. Either the prices increase or the colossal debt makes it possible to compensate it for the most vulnerable population. If the government chooses the debt, it will have the debt, colossal debt, and exorbitant prices. This is the choice we face currently. And last point, let's talk truth. Do not allow the autocrats and the authoritarian to have a discourse of truth. Let's have faith in our democracy and the capacity of response from our people. And we face an unprecedented challenge. We don't have all the solutions. It's going to be complicated, but if we don't do it together, we will be lost. Thank you.
Marianne, après ce panorama.
So we have a real political panorama. Thank you, Minister. Good evening, everyone. Before I comment on what you said, the role of electricity, the role of the networks that is revealed, a few words about the observation. We want to rebalance the energy mix. What is the mix across the world today? We have to observe that you presided a COP. For the last 30 years, from COP to COP, the global greenhouse gas emissions, even if we've all been mobilized to reduce them, have increased. In 2021, we got rid of what we produced in 2020, and coal is responsible for 40% of the increase across the world. If we look at energy in the widest sense of the term for 30 years, it's progressed by 300%. But if we look at the increase in energy consumption, the distribution between the different sources of energy, it stayed quite stable, with 80% for fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, though the relative share has gone down by 1.3% in 30 years. And it's this share that was on the renewable side that went from 15% to 16.5% of the global energy mix. So yes, we have a growth in renewable energies in terms of volumes, but their relative share in the energy mix stays very low and is shifting very little. And I won't go back to the specific context of Europe, the crisis in Ukraine, and problems with supply, but it does show that alongside the climate change challenges, sovereignty issues, and the security of supply that we had perhaps forgotten in the last few years, they're now back in the foreground. So that's the starting point. It's a relative inertia. And if we look at this in more detail, we see that behind this inertia, there are things that have changed, in particular, the development in the final consumption of energy, of the share of electricity. And that's good news. If we look at what the International Energy Agency says, the future is electricity. In France, we're in a specific situation. The average in the world from electricity has gone from 13 to 20%, and we're already at 20%, 25% in our share of electricity in French consumption. Moreover, we're lucky to have electricity that is decarbonized at 90%, which means that we emit 4 to 5 times less CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity than our European neighbors. And you mentioned Germany, Minister. The figures are quite telling. When we look at carbon neutrality in 2050, that is our objective for the world. Depending on the recent scenarios, we have to double the share of electricity in the final consumption of energy. The final consumption will go down. We're going to make huge energy efficiency efforts, minus 40% by 2050, but the relative share of electricity will go from 25% today to 55, 60% maybe in 2050. This is a huge change, a change on the production side. And yes, Minister, in France, we're already in a mixed model where we have electricity produced in a centralized manner, and nuclear plants, thermal plants, hydraulic plants, big offshore wind farms, but more and more decentralized today in the Enedis distribution network, because the renewable production is not just in the air. It's connected to a distribution network. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to transport the electricity. This is also true for electric vehicles. The terminals, the charging terminals, are connected to the electrical network, and we have connected 550,000 renewable production sites to our network, and we have to multiply this by 2 or 3, 1 to 2 million sites. That's what the French programming is set for 2028. It's already a colossal change that is underway, but we're going to have to accelerate. This is also true for usages. Today, we have 900,000 hybrid and rechargeable vehicles and full electric vehicles. What the ADEME says for 2035, the year where we're banning internal combustion vehicles, we'll have to be at several million cars. This is a huge slope to climb, particularly in terms of investment in the distribution networks. And on the NED side, we are forecasting that we'll invest 61 billion by 2035, and Eurelectrique, the electricity distribution association on the European level, has announced 400 billion necessary to invest in distribution networks by this period. So we have 10% of the network in Europe. We're the biggest, and we have 4 to 5 billion annually to invest. This energy transition is underway. We're not there completely, and I will conclude with the challenges that are involved. We require investment, the most intelligent, the best investment possible, but this means that we require investment. This has associated costs, and we can't hide that. To reach our objectives in the most intelligent manner, there's going to be a challenge in terms of employment and skills. The ecological transition for the electricity sector, it already has 30,000 companies of all different sizes, big ones, big suppliers, the distribution companies, the networks, SMEs, and smaller companies that have 600,000 employees in the electrical sector, building, infrastructure, that will participate in this revolution. We need the skills, however, in terms of number and quality, and we know that industry is under tension. The second challenge, our collective capacity to implement energy efficiency, minus 40%, that's a huge amount, particularly in the context of an increasing price of these energies. The third question concerns the sustainability from an economic and social standpoint of an inclusive transition. There was a recent tribune of the 3 biggest electricity suppliers who are NED's customers. We have 80 suppliers. 3 of them are much bigger than the others, and they published an article recently to call for energy sobriety. I don't understand the difference between individual and collective sobriety. Everyone has to participate. Individuals with simple eco-gestures in a global vision that has to be a positive sobriety. This is our third challenge. I am optimistic about the future. I see that behaviors are changing. I see this at the local level, with the local authorities, with our partners, our customers. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of commitment, a lot of attention paid to classic things such as we offer as a free service, my public lighting. Public lighting represents 30% of the electricity bill for a municipality. What we can do today, thanks to the LinkD meter that is rolled out in France, 80% of French people have them in their homes now, we can say to the local authorities, the areas of their lighting network that are breaking down or that have already broken down or are over-consuming electricity, not 10 days later, but the morning, at 8 o'clock in the morning when we calculate, we can give them that information. That's one example amongst many others of the tangible things that we can do to rebalance the energy mix, which will lead us with more certainty towards carbon neutrality in 2050. And just a word to conclude, we must not forget other countries. We talked a lot about Europe, we talked a lot about France, but there are countries in the world where it's not sobriety that's the challenge. It's actually access to electricity, and we still have 800,000 citizens of the world who don't have access to electricity and whose situation in Africa is not improving, but in fact getting worse because of the health crisis. A lot of stakes, a lot of challenges, and I think we need to look at them all in a very lucid manner. So Michel and Marianne have said a lot. I'm going to comment on the theme. I think that the current crisis, you used rebalancing the energy mix as a topic. I've written rebalancing the energy debate. The current crisis reminds us that energy issues are based on three legs. We want available energy. It seems obvious. It seems less today. We want energy that's affordable at a good price. Look at the current debate. And we want energy that is sustainable, that is more ecological. And we talked a lot about the third pillar. Misha at the COP24 put this forward, and at Glasgow 6 months ago, we were talking about the third pillar. The third pillar is a theoretical imperative. We know we have to save the planet. But we observe through the crisis that the two other pillars are now coming back to the foreground. And my experience in 25 years in the world of energy is that pillar two, the price pillar, the cost pillar, is fundamental. Look at what's going on right now, the collective reaction that we have to this crisis. The energy debate. The second comment, when we talk about rebalancing the energy mix, we think that it's a supply problem as it's expressed. But we need to rebalance energy demand also. We're not going to reach this energy transition. I'm not saying my producer's problem should be shifted to other people, but people consume what's being offered. But cars, planes, trains, they function today with a certain type of energy and not with other types. So we have to shift the energy lines. We have to rebalance the energy mix. And to do this, I signed with Catherine and Jean-Bernard an article that made a lot of noise. I'm glad it made a lot of noise. That was the objective. The three of us signed together in a deliberate way. We wanted to say, today we have a short-term topic that concerns purchasing power, the price. That's the reality of the situation. The best way to resolve the problem is to consume less. The objective is not to stop consuming, not to get everyone panicked, but we can reconcile energy security by consuming less, guaranteeing our collective capacity. We can also reconcile purchasing power by consuming less, and we can also have less emissions. In all of our energy transition trajectories, people forget that before you talk about the energy mix and the content, all of these trajectories plan that we should improve our energy efficiency by 2% a year. I think it's 2.5 or 3, while humanity is only doing 1%. This is a major topic, and there's a real opportunity, as Misha said. We move when we're in a crisis. We innovate when we're heading straight into the wall. I see this in my company all the time. Humans are capable of inventing things when they're dealing with a problem. In March 2020, COVID fell upon us. We felt the world was falling apart, but we found solutions to keep working, to keep the system going, despite extraordinary conditions that no crisis scenario had ever planned for. So we have the ability to react, and the call is there. And we said in this article, not small gestures. I have 200 people listening to me here. So we're not asking people to give up on their way of living. They won't do that. But you all know that if you solve or if you adjust your water heater to 50 degrees, it's better than 60 degrees. If you use your washing machine at 30 degrees, your clothes will come out clean, and you will save energy more than if you're washing at 40 degrees. There's so many simple gestures. Heating the house to 19 degrees, maybe not 17 degrees like the Dutch do, but we would still save 7% of French energy consumption. There are so many things we could do, and I'm completely convinced, and that was the aim of our article, our citizens are prepared to make efforts. We can do this collectively, and we'll do it more if we do it all together. This is the fight against energy waste from the 1970s coming back, and as Misha said, if we change behaviors, People have forgotten these reflexes. Purging your radiators before the winter, you'll consume less. There are so many simple things that we can do that we've forgotten, and we just have to relearn these gestures collectively. The balance in demand, and I'll just comment on what Marianne said. What's energy demand like on the planet? An American who consumes 7 tons of petrol equivalents, a European 3.5, a Chinese person 2, an African 0.5, 10 times less than an American. So when we talk about rebalancing demand, it's also asking very deep questions about where efforts have to be made. And when our Western countries, yes, of course, we're at the front lines, and we've developed energy-efficient methods, but you have to take into account the legitimate aspirations of the populations of emerging countries to reach a certain standard of living. If CO2 emissions have increased because the population is growing. Chinese who are now consuming 2 instead of 0.5, and this change in 20 years. Is it illegitimate that these populations have access to energy? No, it's a deep topic. So in this debate, we have to take into account the fact that we have to do more about our own consumption. Americans have divided by 2. They have cars that 15 liters per 100 kilometers. We need to rethink things without changing our standard of living. The way we change our energy consumption, the crisis has brought this to the foreground. This is a good thing because we're solving a problem in the short term and we're adding the medium and long term, which is joining this virtuous circle. A journalist said it's unusual that energy companies say that we should be reducing energy consumption, but it's not unusual. Prices go up, it reduces demand, it leads to bad behavior. So it's not in our interest to have unhappy customers. We want our customers to be happy, like all industry.
Last comment I want to make, yes, to rebalance the mix. Well, the word rebalance refers us to transition today in this discussion, which is highly emotional. We must realize that, in fact, we want to do too many things at the same time. We want the energy system is based, it could be a mistake, but good reasons, on fossil fuels. While oil and why? Because they're the highest density, the cheapest one. Humanity always look for the most efficient fossil. It was availability and cost, but it forgot the durability of energy. That was discovered 25 years ago, roughly, when the climate change crisis, raised our awareness. And in fact, we understood the crisis only in 2015, when all of a sudden there is a kind of a global mobilization. But now there is this system. If we want to ensure the transition, we should take the next 10 years to build a new decarbonated world system. We don't have much of that right now, though. Our absolute priority is not just to stop fossil fuels to have no energy. That's unbearable. So lower your oil production, demand will adapt. No, what to adapt is the price, not demand. This is exactly what's going on. Demand will not adapt itself like that. Price will climb up, and that's not acceptable for a transition. So we have to spend the to build the decarbonated industry to multiply by 10, or I don't know, the renewable energy, but or biogas, and to invest in this system. And once we will have when it will be able to represent 130%, about 30% of the global system, well, we might stop. We'll start reducing the gas or oil field. Otherwise, what happens, that there's a transition problem. I think the French government, by using the word planning, understood some planification, understood something. In order to do transition means that there must be a huge planification effort. We need to organize the transition. Otherwise, I don't think that the market alone will do it, simply because the players we try to optimize. We need public policies to really have an impact on our behaviors. We see the spectacular effect of European policies on the electrical vehicles, without the discussion on diesel, 2035. But even if we change all the vehicles in the world, all of us, if all vehicles were to become electrical, 15% of the world production of oil. It's a lot, but it's not 100%. You'll have to find other innovation for demand tomorrow morning to have this major evolution. So, message is that this rebalancing implies first to good planification. The energy discussion should be more serene and more responsible, as Michel and Marianne do. That is, it is complicated to do. It's not by pressing a knob that will do it. It's not the we should, you should. No, clearly, let's consider that consumers who are here, who are citizens, they want energy all the time, not too expensive and durable. Thank you to the three of you. Lots of converging points in what you said. And what I keep as a guideline is that somehow this crisis we experience it's dreadful. We also have the capability to turn this crisis into an opportunity, make this crisis an opportunity first by changing our behaviors. And Patrick gave us great examples, concrete examples, but we all know that energy transition imposes to reduce the consumption of energy. It was said by Marianne as well, or by about 40% between now and 2030. So we'll have to do it. To do it today, of course, is a good way to control the invoice. And then we need to organize the transition. That was said by all the speakers. The production means we start from a system which is fairly carbonated with external dependence. We have the ability to organize a transition. Transition, what does it mean? Well, electrification of several usages and development of decarbonated electrical energies, and as well, and this was mentioned, signaled, that a certain number of usages will remain gas and more mobility, industrial usage. But for that as well, we need to organize gas transition. And these are a topic of biomethane and renewable hydrogen that will give us a decarbonated mix. So lots of common points, lot of convergence in these talks. So we have 15 minutes. I will start with questions from the room, if any, and I see at least 3, 4, 5. Lots of questions in the room. Who would like to bring a microphone, please? Here, for example. Hello. Hello. A question to Mr. Pouyanné. It has to do with the production capabilities of Total in renewable energy. You did develop your portfolio, and when we look in details, we see there are a lot of production capabilities which are already installed, that you buy portfolios which already exist, especially in India, for example, from what I've seen in your last publications. So my question is simple. Total has huge capacities. When will you accelerate in the net creation of electrical production capabilities in renewables in Europe and elsewhere? You didn't see it well, sorry. We don't buy existing facilities that are too expensive. We don't have that much money, so what we're buying is simply pipelines which are being developed to accelerate the investment. We invest 4 billion in renewable energies, and once more, most of what we've done in terms of operations was to find developers who already have lands, sometimes collections or connections, and we use their financial means. We are net producers, and we build. We had the opportunity to do one operation in India where there was already an existing portfolio, but most of the portfolio in question, which was just incipient, it was 5-7 gigawatts. They will do 30. So we finance the growth from 5 to 30 gigawatts of this Indian portfolio. Likewise in the US, not very active when it comes to buying existing assets. They're too expensive, especially for Total Energy. And in fact, our ambition is to have 35 gigawatts between now and 2035. Most of the assets which have been bought with 10 out of 35, and after that 100 gigawatts. That's the strategy for economic reasons. Patrick Portolano, Association of Energy and Oil Consultant. 3 questions to the 3 speakers. Start with Patrick Pouyanné. First, should we really decarbonate economic activities to solve the climate crisis? Shouldn't we, in fact, intensify the implementation of naturally carbonated, carbon-negative industrial processes, and, for example, geological carbon sequestration, trapping, which is one of the total activities, or second question, don't you think that there should be upstream tax policies for carbon rather than downstream policies which penalize consumers? In other words, to penalize the companies which produce oil and coal so that they would have reserves to manage the full carbon cycle. And last proposal would be to show that in the COP27 as a proposal. Thank you for the questions, which are fairly technical. Price, carbon price, but I didn't quite the first question. I think I'm not mad about geological trapping of carbon to storage. There are limitations in everything, and I think it's not a universal solution. It's not as simple as that. The carbon sequestration needs better to be close to the North Sea, but not everywhere. It calls for expensive infrastructures, and we would store 15%, no more. So it is been more useful to try to tackle the problem at the source, where there are technologies in industrial centers. So there's, when we can change the energies, I think the best carbon emissions are the ones we won't do. So, in my opinion, it's better to spend money by supporting the industrialists to rethink that when they exist. It's true for steel, it's not true for cement. It's more complicated, but industry we can do, others we can't. So carbon sequestration or trapping should be really limited to industries where we won't have a choice, but I'm not a fan. We should develop it. I mean, to be neutral, there will always be oil consumption, industry, and usages, but let's not make it the total solution. To put a price on carbon chain is the best way to send signals such that tractors will react, but it's complicated at the end, so translation the final customers to accept.
Vous avez évoqué la COP 27, moi la COP 24.
So about COP24, I went to see my professor, Jean Tirole, from the Toulouse school, who intelligently looks at carbon taxation as a solution that's imposed from an economic point of view, but economics doesn't rhyme with political economy. When you have 196 countries in front of you, that's the size. I found a consensus among the 196 countries. So it doesn't work. Yes, carbon taxation can work in some countries, but it has perverse effects immediately. It creates decisions between different countries, different products. You have to count from the beginning what is the share of steel that was used to produce such car in one country. The chassis was produced in one country and then taxed in another country. It's very complicated, and we're dealing with that right now. It's called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I've forgotten how you say it in French. In Europe, we'll innovate, we'll set up in our borders a type of carbon taxation, knowing that this will lead to effects that we can't imagine yet on world trade. The Chinese haven't looked at this saying, well, that's fabulous. We're applauding you. So we're in talking politics now, and in a debate for COP27, I'm in contact with my colleague who's the Minister of the Environment in Egypt, Yasmin Fouad. It's not the preoccupation of the Africans today, unfortunately, or happily, I don't know. We'll take another question. I'm looking for women who are asking questions. Hello, thank you for having stressed the need to rebalance demand through sobriety, but also through investments in heat pumps, for instance. And these investments have to be made in households and then in companies. And the question is the ability of households to finance heat pumps. Are there models where energy suppliers would finance these installations like the telecommunications? So I think we do this already. Marianne, we've set up loans that make it possible to finance households to make the initial investment. So I'm sure that it was set up 2 years ago. Do you want to add? I don't install or sell heat pumps, air ones, but we connect them, and this is developing because the thermal regulations are changing and forbids fuel boilers. So people have to move on to other sources of energy. And it's one of the changes in terms of usage. We talked about electric vehicles, but the way we heat and do and air condition are going through big changes. They're subsidized today, but in part by the state and by suppliers. I'll add a good practice from Poland. The equivalent on Total for gas, PGNigen, the Polish gas company, a big producer of gas. I introduced the possibility as a minister to have there's an obligation on companies to reach energy efficiency through certificates, and companies can substitute this obligation by installing a heat pump at a customer's, and it really boosted demand. We can take 1 or 2 questions. If there's a woman who would like to ask a question, I think that would be great. Or a student? Thank you for these very interesting interventions. So 2 words, technology and sobriety, come to mind. So a question, in your personal behavior, in your personal lives, what have you done to reduce your energy consumption and your CO2 production? Thank you for this question. We try to do things. We're counting a lot on young people. We know they're very committed, like Patrick does. I wash at 30 degrees, and I use the 800 RPM spin cycle. Yes, you have to go use all the good ideas. So spinning at 800 RPM, that's good. So we all have behavioral changes to make. You unplug appliances, you bring the heat down, you avoid air conditioning or overly air conditioning, you walk, take a bike, and we do it in our companies. Be convinced of that. Enedis has the #2 fleet of electric vehicles behind La Poste. What we do is, I talked about the Linky meter. Between the first one and today's, it's completely changed in terms of the composition, materials that are easy to recycle. We have a reuse platform in our company. The regional teams exchange materials in the end of life. So perhaps we don't do enough, and we're ready to do more, but we're already working hard. I heat to 19 degrees, and I ride an electric bike on the weekends. I'm Polish, so no, I'm laughing. what Patrick said about the different levels of consumption between countries. Poland has still not reached the European average in terms of energy consumption, particularly for electricity in France. We're at a ratio of 1 to 2. So welcome to Warsaw. We're very exemplary in terms of energy consumption and CO2 production. But I go to work on a bike. I was the only minister, to my knowledge, who would systematically go to work on a bicycle. And people thought that I was a bit strange. And I had a car that was offered to me. So it's a good practice I recommend. So, Mr. Casca, you talked about the renaissance of European nuclear. We have NG and Total Energies here. Enedis. Enedis doesn't belong to NG. We're independent. So nuclear, not in my backyard. I support it. We'll see the renewal of nuclear energy. It's decarbonated, but will allow us to work with renewables also. But not all. You can't do everything in a company, so it's not our company that will do it. So tonight I'm Cercle des économistes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So a lot of ideas for the short and medium term.